It was the spring of 1853 when the winds changed in Hollow Creek, Texas. Not the kind of change measured by seasons or clocks, but the slow, bone-deep shift that old men feel in their joints and children sense in the corners of dreams they can't remember. The sun still rose with its same dull fire, and the dust still rolled in sheets across the dead wheat fields. But something underneath the town had begun to stir, and it announced itself the day the Bellamy family arrived. Not with trumpet nor wagon rattle, but with silence, deep and unnatural. A hush so profound that even the saloon doors didn't creak and the dogs stopped barking to watch the wagon pass. Pulled by 4 black mules with milky eyes that didn't blink and didn't breathe like animals should. Ezekiel Bellamy, the father, sat high on the bench, thin as a switch and wrapped in a black preacher's coat, though no one had seen him hold a sermon, and beside him were the 5 boys, Elijah, Abram, Silas, Gideon, and Thorn, all tall, all pale, all utterly identical in face and build, and the way they did not move unless in perfect unison, like 5 limbs of one terrible body. They said nothing as they passed the general store, the post, the chapel, only stared straight ahead with ice-colored eyes that never reflected sunlight, and mouths that were always slightly parted, as if in anticipation of something they had no permission to speak. When they reached the north edge of town, where the forest began, the cursed woods, the elders called it, where maps ended and compasses spun, they stopped without command, unhooked the mules, and began building a cabin with pre-cut logs that no one saw them mill, the walls rising quickly, unnaturally, as though gravity were different on that ridge. Reverend Calder, a man who had buried more men than he'd baptized, rode up to welcome them with a tin of biscuits and a trembling smile, but returned pale and sweating, muttering about the boys chanting in Latin that wasn't Latin, their mouths unmoving, and Ezekiel clutching a book that didn't have pages but thin metal sheets etched with lines that moved when touched. And from that day on, the Reverend no longer rang the chapel bell. Said he heard screams when he did. Townsfolk tried to ignore the Bellamys, chalking them up to God's cruel sense of humor, but the land knew different. Cattle refused to graze near the ridge, birds avoided the trees around the house, and every night a low hum, like the sound of bees inside a bottle, came from their chimneyless roof, with pulses of blue light that flickered against the mist like some distant electrical storm, though none had ever touched Hollow Creek. The brothers never came to town, except once, when Elijah walked into the apothecary, silent as smoke, handed over a list written in reversed script, and left with bottles the doctor didn't even remember stocking, roots, powders, old bone fragments, and every time he stepped, the floorboards hissed like steam vents under strain. Within weeks, children began waking with bleeding noses and dreams of the 5 brothers standing in their rooms, pointing at the walls, mouthing words no one could hear. Animals were found eviscerated but not eaten, arranged in precise spirals in fields where no footprints marked the ground. And one morning, a shepherd boy named Henry found a stone circle in the woods near their home, perfectly symmetrical and carved with symbols that shimmered faintly even in full daylight. His tongue swelled so badly he never spoke again. Still, Ezekiel came to town on Sundays, never entering the chapel but standing outside it with a wide-brimmed hat and hands clasped behind his back, whispering to the wind while his sons stood in the distance like sentries, unmoving, their shadows always pointing the wrong way. When asked what he was doing, he replied only once, holding the gate shut. In July, the widow Lillian Markham reported hearing a sound like distant breathing beneath her floorboards, and the next day her cellar door was missing, entirely gone, hinges and all replaced with a smooth slab of stone that no one could lift or scratch. Every attempt to investigate the Bellamy homestead failed. Tools rusted, maps blurred, and horses refused to climb the ridge, bucking violently until turned away. Then, one night, the moon turned orange and the air smelled like copper, and Reverend Calder, possessed by fear or faith no one could tell, rode up to confront Ezekiel, carrying a shotgun in one hand and a crucifix in the other, but only made it halfway before turning back, white as a corpse, whispering, "They're sealed, they were never meant to be opened," and refusing to ever explain what he meant. That night the preacher was found hanged in his own barn, rope looped twice around his neck, eyes wide open and teeth shattered as if he had bitten down on stone, and the Bellamy boys watched from their field as the sun rose, unmoving, unspeaking, their father's body swaying behind them. When the townsfolk dared investigate, they found no footprints, no ladder, and no shadow under the hanging man. Ezekiel was buried in a pine box, deep in the cursed part of the cemetery. But when they returned weeks later, the grave was empty, the coffin open, the nails pulled out one by one and stacked neatly beside the hole. Shortly after, strange lights began appearing above the ridge, columns of flame that made no heat, spheres of lightning that hovered without sound, and always the hum, deeper now, vibrating through teeth and bone. People moved away, left in the dead of night, some without even packing, while others, like old Mr. Harlan, went mad and carved spirals into the chapel pews until his hands bled dry. No one dared speak the Bellamy name, but everyone knew they had brought something with them. Or worse, they were the thing, a tether to something older than memory and hungrier than sin. The last to leave was Miss Mercy Green, who tried to warn the children, painting symbols on their doors in lamb's blood, but vanished the night she completed the last one, her body never found, only her shoes placed perfectly side by side at the edge of the Bellamy field. By fall, only a handful of families remained, too stubborn or too frightened to go, and the brothers still stood, sometimes at the edge of town, sometimes in windows, always watching, always the same expressionless, unreadable stare. Their cabin never aged, no rot, no weathering, and the trees around it stopped growing, their rings frozen in time. Some said the boys were not born but built, not sons but sentinels, and that Ezekiel's true name had been erased from records to keep him hidden. One letter, sent from a passing missionary, described them as the 5 Keys, and warned that the 6th had been buried too deep. But the letter arrived smudged, the paper warped as though dipped in oil, and the missionary was found drowned in a river with no water nearby. And so Hollow Creek waited, under a sky that no longer wept, and stars that blinked too slowly, waited for the silence to break, for the brothers to move, for the thing behind their eyes to blink. And as the year grew darker, they knew somehow they were already too late, that whatever the Bellamys had sealed, it was already whispering through the cracks. After the death of Ezekiel Bellamy, when the body was found gently swaying from the rafters of his barn with no visible means of ascent and no mark of struggle, the brothers did not mourn, nor did they move from their habitual post at the edge of the ridge, 5 silhouettes etched against the morning fog like statues carved from ash. And it was this unnatural calm, this collective stillness of grief where none should exist, that made the people of Hollow Creek whisper more often behind closed shutters and double-bar the doors they had never before locked. But whispers carry, and one of them found its way down river, past San Felipe, over the Trinity, until it reached Galveston, where a man named Horace Alcott sat hunched over a letter, stained with candle wax, his spectacles low on his nose and his fingertips trembling with the rare thrill of professional obsession. For Alcott was no ordinary physician, nor even a reputable one. He was what the medical boards of 2 states had called recklessly deviant, having pursued studies in anatomical synchrony, inherited memory, and the theory of soul symmetry, a theory so far outside the boundaries of conventional science it bordered on heresy and madness. But to Alcott, truth was not confined to charts and dissections, and the mention of 5 brothers identical in physiology, behavior, and response despite no record of twinship or genetic explanation ignited a hunger in him that no ethics could starve. So he packed his traveling satchel with vials and scalpels and tomes bound in waxen leather, one of which had been banned in 3 countries, and he rode alone day and night to Hollow Creek, where the trees leaned away from the Bellamy property and the wind changed direction the closer he came. And when he finally arrived, disheveled and grinning, he did not ask permission from the townsfolk. He simply went to the brothers, who stood in their customary formation beneath the cedar tree, and introduced himself as if they had already been expecting him, and perhaps they had, because they turned in eerie synchrony, and without a word, opened the door to their cabin and let him inside, where the air was unnaturally cold and smelled faintly of lavender, iron, and something older. For 6 months, Alcott lived among them, in the half-rotten cabin that never collected dust and whose walls pulsed faintly if stared at too long, and he documented everything in journals that would later be found buried. Beneath the altar of the church, written in ink mixed with his own blood. He wrote that the brothers did not speak in his presence, yet he heard whispers in the walls whenever he fell asleep, and sometimes awoke with new sentences written on his notes in handwriting that was not his. He observed them eat meals in silence, yet not a crumb fell to the floor. He tracked their pulses and found them identical to the second, with heartbeats that synced even in rest, and when he separated them in 5 rooms for an experiment, each one hummed the same frequency until the walls of the house trembled and a mirror shattered without impact. Their blood, drawn cautiously and only once per brother, was dark, almost black, and cooled instantly on contact with air, leaving behind residue that shimmered under moonlight and repelled flies as if it were still alive. Their bones, tested with a tuning fork, vibrated longer than human ones should, and X-rays he produced with a rudimentary machine built from storm-scavenged parts showed not marrow, but a kind of fractal geometry where solid calcium should be. They never aged. Of this he was sure. He checked their teeth, skin elasticity, ocular clarity, and all of it resisted time. Not merely slowing, but reversing in short bursts that he could not explain, especially after one boy, Thorne, developed a fever that rose past 108 degrees, and rather than burn or convulse, he cooled rapidly the moment Elijah touched his wrist, the fever migrating, visibly from one body to the other, until both stood again in complete balance. Alcott began to unravel, and with unraveling came deeper inquiry. He studied Ezekiel's belongings, which the brothers never touched, and found within the false bottom of a cabinet a Bible whose pages had been carefully scraped clean and rewritten in ink that seemed to shift between black and gold depending on where the reader stood, filled not with scripture, but with diagrams of the human brain, overlaid with astrological maps and Norse runes scratched through with symbols that predated recorded history, and at the center of the book, stitched rather than printed, was a folded page of parchment depicting 5 identical men standing in a ring around a 6th faceless figure bound in chains made of glyphs. It was labeled The Convergence, 5 to hold, 1 to seal, and beneath that, in Ezekiel's unmistakable hand, they are not born, they are assigned. From that moment on, Alcott's work changed, not to understand them, but to locate the 6th, for the diagrams suggested a system incomplete, a ritual paused mid-breath, and he scoured the forest at night with lanterns and dowsing rods, marking trees with ash and string, convinced that beneath the Bellamy land lay a chamber, a vault, or a vessel containing the missing piece. He questioned the brothers, but received only silence and unbroken stares until, one night while sketching by candlelight, he noticed 5 smudges on the wall of his room. Fingerprints too large to be his smeared in concentric circles around the image of the 6th figure. And that night he dreamed of drowning in air, of metal rooms with no doors, and of a child's voice saying, "He comes undone when we name him." By now, Alcott's journal entries had shifted from clinical notes to desperate prayers, written in overlapping scripts and mirrored text, often concluding with the phrase, "I must not become the 6th." And on the night of September 2nd, he was seen by a passer-by entering the town church with 3 oil lamps, a bag of salt, and every candle he could carry, his eyes sunken and lips moving rapidly in a language the observer could not place. He locked the doors from inside and lit the candles in a precise pattern, 1 for each corner of the room and a 5th in the center, and began to chant while staring at his own reflection, though no mirror was present. When the townspeople arrived at dawn, concerned by the never-dimming lights, they found him kneeling at the altar, eyes wide open but devoid of iris and color, just a blank white sheen like milk poured over glass. And in his lap, his journal, open to the final page, with only 1 sentence scrawled across it in enormous, looping handwriting. 5 came through, the 6th could not follow. He died hours later, bloodless and blind, yet with no sign of trauma, and the medical examiner, though pressured, refused to sign a cause of death, instead sealing the body in a lead-lined coffin at Alcott's own prior instruction. After his death, changes in the Bellamy brothers were subtle at first, the way they stood a few inches off the ground, when no one stared directly, how their shadows moved independently during sunset, and how their heads turned precisely 5 seconds before someone approached them, as if their awareness extended beyond physical senses. They no longer walked, but glided, silently, across the grass without bending a blade, and their presence triggered odd reactions. Compasses failed near them, milk curdled instantly, and clocks ran backward for as long as they stood in a room. The remaining townsfolk grew desperate, hired a medium from Louisiana who lasted less than an hour before vomiting blood and screaming, "It's not the 5th, it's the one before the 1st," and clawing her own ears until they bled. Rumors swirled that the 6th, whatever or whoever it was, had once been sealed under the Bellamy land, and that Ezekiel had offered his sons as locks, not children, living keys in human skin, and with his death the seals were weakening. Alcott's buried journal was dug up in secret by 3 teenage boys who sought to understand, but only one returned, unable to speak, eyes stuck in a permanent state of dilation, clutching a single page that read, "They rotate when no one looks." The church bell, long silent, began to ring at odd hours, even though the rope had long since been removed, and always 5 tolls, no more, no less. Those who remained in Hollow Creek learned not to question any more, only to endure. But even endurance wore thin when dreams began to infect the waking world. Doors opening to reveal impossible architecture, whispering corridors, and always the sense that a 6th presence stood just out of view, behind the eye, breathing softly. A final, anonymous letter reached the State Archives in 1909, describing Hollow Creek as a failed containment site, and warning that each brother aligns to a cardinal point, and the center, the silence, is waking. But no follow-up was ever made, and the town vanished from maps after a fire that left no burn marks and destroyed no buildings, only erased names, memories, and the very concept of direction within its borders. Today, no one lives where Hollow Creek once stood, and the only sign of its existence is a circle of trees that lean outward in perfect geometry. And on quiet nights, 5 faint lights can still be seen hovering above the ridge, motionless, watching, waiting, not for rescue, not for redemption, but for return. On the morning of October 17, 1853, Hollow Creek awoke to a silence so profound that even the animals refused to stir, as if the very earth had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. And that silence, thick, velvety, suffocating, hung over the town like a woolen shroud soaked in dread. The air tasted metallic, the way it does before lightning splits open the sky, and the clouds above churned as if battling something unseen, their black bellies swollen with more than rain. Inside the church, Pastor Halberd knelt before the altar, his prayer whispered but frantic, for he had dreamed the same vision for 3 nights. 5 figures ablaze in blue flame, unburned and silent, staring back at him with eyes that knew too much, and behind them a hole in the sky that bled darkness and teeth. The Bellamy homestead, standing stubbornly at the edge of town like a scab that never healed, had no shown signs of life in days. No smoke from the chimney, no sound of tools or horses. And yet that morning, all 5 brothers, Elijah, Abram, Silas, Gideon, and Thorn, were seen standing motionless at the edge of their fields, barefooted and shirtless, their hands raised toward the storm that swirled above them like a mouth about to speak. The townspeople, those brave enough to watch from a distance, noted that the brothers moved not at all, not even as the wind howled or the thunder groaned like some wounded god overhead. And the more superstitious among them claimed they could hear chanting, though no lips moved, a guttural harmony that made the hairs on their necks rise like soldiers answering roll call. Sheriff Manton rode out to confront them, driven less by duty and more by the gnawing certainty that something ancient had been disturbed. But he turned back after less than a mile, mumbling about his compass spinning in circles and a voice whispering his own name from inside the trees. At noon, lightning struck the same spot 3 times, and on the 3rd, the brothers lifted their faces skyward in unison, their mouths now open and emitting no sound, but something deeper, subaudible and foul, rippled through the bones of all who watched, a sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than above it. Then, all 5 Bellamy brothers burst into blue flame, not consumed but illuminated, frozen in position, eyes wide and mouths slack, as though caught mid-scream, though their bodies made no motion, and the flames neither danced nor flickered, but hovered like a veil of shimmering light clinging to their skin. 1 heartbeat later they were gone, utterly, completely, without ash or smoke or scorch mark, leaving behind only 5 blackened impressions in the soil, perfectly shaped like their feet, yet several inches deep, as though they'd been standing atop a sponge too. Hat suddenly gave way. In the hours that followed, no birds flew overhead, and the rain, which had begun to pour down with fury, abruptly ceased the moment it crossed into the Bellamy field, as if the sky itself recognized that the land below was no longer part of this earth. The few townspeople who ventured to the homestead in the days that followed spoke in hushed tones of rooms turned backward, mirrors that reflected unfamiliar faces, and a cellar that seemed deeper than physics would allow, where the stairway descended in impossible spirals and voices whispered in tongues no one spoke, promising revelations in exchange for names. Children born that month were marked, one with black eyes that never blinked, another with a spiral-shaped birthmark over her heart, and a third who cried only when the moon was full, and then only in reverse, as though inhaling grief. The town, shaken to its marrow, razed the Bellamy home to its foundations, burning what would burn and burying what wouldn't, and when they salted the earth, the salt turned pink as blood and refused to sink. Livestock miscarried. Men forgot their wives' names, and the schoolteacher, Miss Albright, went mad after drawing 5 interlocked circles on the chalkboard, her final words before vanishing being, "They were never meant to stay," scrawled in charcoal across the entire east wall. Scientists came years later, some from Boston, others under quiet contracts with organizations that did not officially exist, but none stayed longer than a single night. One left behind a journal filled with diagrams of impossible anatomy and descriptions of hearing the soil breathing, while another mailed a vial of dirt to MIT in 1931, only for the package to disappear en route and the courier's name to vanish from every census and registry. To this day, no known living descendant of the Bellamy bloodline can be found, despite records suggesting a sprawly family tree in Tennessee and Kentucky. Every documented relative either went missing, changed their surname, or died under peculiar circumstances before the age of 35. The U.S. Geological Survey attempted to catalog the area in 1947, but quietly labeled the region unsuitable for investigation, and redacted the coordinates in their final report, which included only a blurred photo of 5 smoldering impressions in a cracked field and a handwritten note. They knew we were watching. Today, Hollow Creek is a ghost town in all but name. 58 residents who do not speak of the past and who maintain a strict unwritten rule. No one walks past the burnt patch after sunset. No one names their children Elijah, Abram, Silas, Gideon, or Thorn, and no one digs deeper than 6 inches anywhere near the old Bellamy land. And if you find the oldest living woman in town, Margaret Haley, blind in both eyes but said to have seen the storm of 1853 with perfect clarity, She'll speak just one sentence to anyone foolish enough to ask what happened. They weren't born here. They were retrieved. Before closing her mouth tight as coffin nails and humming a song no one recognizes, a melody that curls like smoke into your ears and refuses to leave, even in dreams, where 5 pale-eyed brothers still stand in blue flame, waiting.